The ritual began with the sun, as it had every day for 7 years. Caleb Morrison would rise in the cool, pre-dawn gray of his small ranch house, the floorboards groaning a familiar protest under his weight. He'd light the stove, put the coffee on to boil, and stand at the screen door, looking out over the valley. The land was his catechism, the rise and fall of the hills a silent prayer he knew by heart. And every morning his shadow, the other half of his solitude, would rise with him. Rusty, a German shepherd whose coat was the color of dried blood and old gold, would stretch, his powerful limbs unfolding with a groan that mirrored the house's own. He'd pad over to Caleb, rest his heavy head against his master's thigh, and wait. The loyalty in that simple gesture was a physical presence in the quiet kitchen, as tangible as the smell of brewing coffee and baking dust. They were a unit, a man and his dog, etched into the landscape as surely as the winding path of Miller's Creek. But their unity had a fracture line, a place it broke every single day. That place was the bridge. After the morning chores, the chickens fed, the fences checked on the near pasture, they would begin their walk. It was the same route, a 3-mile loop that bordered the western edge of Caleb's property. And it always ended, or rather it always stalled, at the old wooden bridge spanning the creek. It wasn't much of a structure, just weathered gray planks and 2 sturdy railings, bleached and splintered by years of sun and the occasional flash flood. To Caleb, it was a convenience, a shortcut to the north pasture. To Rusty, it was a monster. The change would begin 100 yards out. The dog's easy, loping gait would tighten. His ears, usually alert and expressive, would swivel back, pressing flat against his skull. A low whine, a sound of pure, primordial distress, would begin in his throat. By the time they reached the edge of the first plank, he was a different animal. His body would go rigid, legs locked, tail tucked so far between his legs it practically disappeared. He trembled, a violent, deep body shudder that Caleb could feel through the soles of his own boots. His eyes, normally intelligent and warm, would glaze over with a panic so profound it seemed to pull him back through time, into a memory that wasn't his own. "Easy, boy," Caleb would murmur, his voice a low rumble of useless reassurance. "It's just a bridge, same bridge as yesterday." He'd crouch, running a calloused hand down the dog's back, feeling the knotted muscles, the frantic thumping of his heart. He'd tried everything over the years, coaxing with strips of jerky, a firm tone, a gentle leash. Once, in a fit of frustration, he had tried to carry him. Rusty had yelped, a sound of such agony and terror that Caleb had dropped him instantly, ashamed. The dog had scrambled away, cowering 20 feet back, looking at Caleb with an expression of utter betrayal. He never tried that again. So, the ritual was set. Caleb would sigh, a sound of weary resignation, and pat the dog's head one last time. "All right, the long way then." And they would turn, leaving the bridge behind, and follow the creek bed for another half-mile to a shallow, rocky ford. It added 20 minutes to their walk, 20 minutes of Caleb's baffled frustration and Rusty's slow return to normalcy. Once they were clear of the bridge's unseen orbit, the trembling would subside. The tail would tentatively uncurl, and by the time they reached the ford, he was a dog again, splashing happily in the shallow water. Caleb had found Rusty 7 years ago, a half-starved pup cowering under that very bridge. He was skin and bones, his coat matted with burrs and mud, one ear torn. He'd been skittish, but not broken. It was Caleb's quiet patience, the slow offering of food and a gentle hand, that had won him over. Within a month, the dog was his shadow, a guardian of profound devotion. But the bridge remained a site of unspeakable trauma, a psychological barrier neither time nor love could breach. Caleb had long ago given up trying to understand it. He simply accepted it, the way he accepted the blistering summer heat or the bitter winter wind. It was just a part of Rusty, a piece of a past the dog could not share and Caleb could not heal. But this year, something was different. The heat had arrived early, and settled in with the weight of a physical occupation. The sky was a pale, bleached-out blue, empty of clouds for weeks on end. The grasses in the valley, usually a vibrant green well into June, had already faded to the color of tired straw. The air was thick with dust that coated everything, a fine red powder that grit between Caleb's teeth and filmed the water in the troughs. A drought was tightening its grip on the land, a slow, merciless strangulation, and as the earth changed, so did the ritual at the bridge. The water level in Miller's Creek began to drop. What was usually a lively, chattering current slowed to a sluggish crawl. The banks, once soft and loamy, began to pull back, exposing smooth, pale stones that hadn't seen the sun in years. As the water receded, Rusty's anxiety escalated. His daily refusal at the bridge became more frantic. The whining started sooner, the trembling more violent. He began to have nightmares, his legs twitching in his sleep, guttural yelps and whimpers escaping his throat until Caleb would wake him with a gentle shake. "Easy, Rusty. You're here. You're safe." But the dog would pant for an hour afterward, his eyes wide in the dark, staring at nothing. Then came the howling. It was a new and terrifying sound. In the dead of night, Rusty would go to the screen door, his nose pointed toward the creek, and let out a long, mournful cry that echoed across the silent valley. It wasn't the bark of a watchdog or the happy yip of a chase. It was a sound of profound grief, a lament for something lost that raised the hair on Caleb's arms. It was the sound of a keening, a lonely vigil over a grave only he could see. Caleb would stand behind him in the darkness, a hand on his loyal friend's back, feeling the sorrow vibrate through the animal's entire being. He felt a creeping unease, a sense that the dog's strange behavior and the relentless drought were connected, two threads in a story that was slowly, ominously, beginning to unravel. The land was changing, and it felt like it was trying to speak, to give up a secret it had held for too long. Caleb didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in the oppressive stillness of the air, in the cracking earth beneath his feet, and most of all, in the inconsolable 7-year sorrow of his dog. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating the land into submission. By mid-July, Miller's Creek was no longer a creek at all. It was a scar, a dry, cracked ravine littered with thirsty stones and the skeletons of last year's reeds. The water had shrunk to a series of stagnant, algae-filmed pools that shimmered with a sickly green light in the heat. The air smelled of baked mud and decay. Caleb's cattle stood listlessly in the shade of the few cottonwoods that hadn't yet surrendered their leaves, their ribs showing more prominently each day. Every morning, Caleb hauled water from his well, the pump handle groaning in protest, his own body aching with the effort. The valley was holding its breath, waiting for a release that never came. Rusty's nightly howls were now a fixture of the darkness, as regular and as haunting as the call of a distant coyote. They scraped at Caleb's nerves, a constant reminder of the tension that had settled over his ranch. The dog was thinner, his appetite gone, his eyes perpetually ringed with a kind of weary vigilance. The walk to the bridge was an ordeal. Rusty would begin to pant and whine the moment they left the house, as if the very air in that direction was toxic. Caleb persisted, not out of stubbornness, but because the routine was the only solid thing left in a world that was drying up and blowing away. It was a pilgrimage to a shared mystery, a daily act of faith in his dog's incomprehensible fear. One sweltering afternoon, a plume of dust on the valley road announced a visitor. It was a rare enough event to make Caleb stop his work mending a fence and watch. A tired-looking horse pulled a small, dusty buckboard, and at the reins sat a woman. She pulled up near the house, her movements stiff with exhaustion. She was maybe in her late 30s, with a face that was handsome, but etched with a deep, abiding worry. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, a startlingly clear blue, scanned the ranch with a searching intensity. "Afternoon," Caleb said, approaching slowly, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. Rusty, who had been lying in the sliver of shade by the porch, rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy, boy," Caleb said softly. The woman's eyes flickered to the dog, then back to Caleb. "Sorry to trespass. My horse threw a shoe a ways back. I was hoping I might be able to get some water, for myself and for him." Her voice was steady, but carried the dry rasp of thirst. "Of course," Caleb said, gesturing toward the well. "Help yourself. I'm Caleb Morrison." "Martha Kane," she replied, climbing down from the buckboard. She moved with a purpose that seemed at odds with her apparent exhaustion. As Caleb worked the pump, filling a bucket for her horse, she looked around the valley, her gaze lingering on the dry ribbon of the creek. "This drought, it's bad everywhere," she said, more to herself than to him. "Worst I've seen in 20 years, Caleb agreed, handing her a dipper of cool water. She drank it gratefully, closing her eyes for a moment. "I'm not just passing through, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "I'm looking for someone, or for some answers, I suppose." Caleb waited, his curiosity piqued. Visitors were rare, visitors with a quest were unheard of. "My brother," she continued, her blue eyes locking onto his. "His name was Thomas Kane. He came out this way 7 years ago. He was a land surveyor working for the territorial government. He was mapping claims, water rights. He wrote me a letter from the town of Redemption, about 40 miles east of here. Said he was heading into this valley next. That was the last I ever heard from him." 7 years. The number landed in the hot, still air with a sudden weight. Caleb felt a strange prickling on his skin, the kind that comes just before a lightning strike. He looked over at Rusty, who was still watching the woman, the growl in his chest having subsided to a quiet, watchful stillness. "He was traveling with a wagon," Martha went on, her gaze unwavering. "A light surveyor's wagon, and a single horse. He carried his equipment, his maps, and an iron strongbox. He said the box had sensitive documents, records of claims, payments. He said some men were getting rich off land they didn't own, off water they were stealing. He thought he had the proof." Caleb's throat went dry. He thought of the bridge, the pup he'd found cowering beneath it. 7 years ago. It was a coincidence, surely. The valley was wide, men got lost, but the pieces fit together with a chilling, unwelcome precision. "Did you talk to the law?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. A bitter smile touched Martha's lips. "For 7 years. Sheriff Hawkins, in Redemption. He's a good man. He looked. But the territorial marshal at the time said Thomas probably just ran off. Said men do it all the time out here, chasing gold or a new life. They closed the file." She paused, reaching into a satchel she'd brought from the buckboard. She pulled out a worn leather billfold, and from it, a small sepia-toned photograph. This was him. She handed it to Caleb. The photograph showed a young man, barely into his 20s, with an open, honest face and the same clear blue eyes as his sister. He was smiling, leaning against a wagon wheel, full of the easy confidence of youth. Caleb stared at the face, a ghost from a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly, becoming his own. He didn't recognize the man, not consciously, but there was a disquieting familiarity, a sense that he was looking at a face he should know. The seed of a dreadful suspicion, planted by the words 7 years, began to sprout in the barren ground of his mind. "He wouldn't have run off," Martha said, her voice thick with a conviction that had clearly survived 7 years of doubt and dismissal. "He wasn't built that way. Something happened to him. Here, in this valley." Caleb handed the photograph back, his hand unsteady. His gaze drifted past her, toward the low hills and the dry creek bed, toward the bridge. Rusty, sensing the shift in his master, padded over and pressed against his leg, letting out a soft whine. He was looking in the same direction. Caleb looked down at the dog, at the old, healed tear in his ear, at the deep, inexplicable trauma in his eyes, and for the first time, he felt he wasn't just looking at a frightened animal. He was looking at the sole witness to a 7-year-old crime. The heat, the silence, the dog's grief, the sister's search. It was all coalescing, drawing him toward the one place on his land that held a palpable darkness, the place his loyal friend had been guarding all along. The wooden bridge over Miller's Creek. The creek was giving up its ghosts. Each day the sun peeled back another layer of time, revealing a history written in mud and stone. What had been a murky pool a week ago was now a damp depression. The bones of the land were showing. Long, curved pieces of wood, dark and waterlogged, began to emerge from the caked mud directly downstream from the bridge. At first, Caleb tried to convince himself they were just driftwood, old logs washed down in some forgotten flood. But their shape was too deliberate, their placement too specific. They were the curved ribs of a wagon's canopy, the splintered remains of a wheel hub. He didn't tell Martha at first. He let her stay, offering her the small guest room, an act of hospitality that felt more like a duty. Her presence was a constant, quiet hum of purpose that amplified the dread growing in his own gut. He watched her from a distance as she walked the valley, her solitary figure stark against the bleached landscape, her head bowed as if searching for a sign. He knew where the sign was. Rusty's terror had reached a fever pitch. He would no longer go anywhere near the creek, even at the shallow ford they had used for years. He spent his days pressed against the screen door of the house, panting, his eyes fixed on the bridge. The howling was no longer confined to the night. It would erupt suddenly, a raw, ragged sound of pure anguish, whenever a gust of wind carried a scent up from the drying creek bed. The dog was coming apart, and Caleb knew why. The smell of the past was rising from the earth, and it was the smell of his trauma. Finally, Caleb could ignore it no longer. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, he found Martha sitting on his porch, the photograph of her brother in her hands. "There's something you should see," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up, her blue eyes filled with a weary hope. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood and followed him. He didn't take the path. He walked straight through the dry pasture, Rusty trailing a few paces behind, whining softly, as if he knew their destination. When they reached the edge of the ravine, Caleb pointed. "Down there." The light was failing, casting long, distorted shadows across the creek bed. But the shapes were unmistakable now. The skeletal frame of a wagon was emerging from the mud, tilted on its side as if tossed there by a giant hand. A single wheel, almost entirely intact, pointed accusingly at the sky. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She scrambled down the steep bank, her boots slipping on the loose shale. Caleb followed, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. She ran her hand over the rotted wood, her touch both reverent and horrified. "This is it," she whispered. "This has to be it." Caleb's gaze swept the area. His eyes, trained by years of scanning the landscape for stray cattle or signs of predators, picked up on something else. A few yards from the wagon, half buried in a mound of silt and tangled roots, was a small, pale object. It was curved and unnaturally white against the dark earth. He walked toward it, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. He knelt, his fingers brushing away the dry soil. It was bone, the knobbed end of a femur, and next to it, peeking from the dirt, were the delicate, unmistakable shapes of a human hand. Martha saw it at the same moment. A choked sob escaped her, a sound of grief finally finding its object after 7 years of searching. She sank to her knees beside the remains, her shoulders shaking. Caleb stood over her, a helpless sentinel. The silence of the valley pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by her quiet weeping and the frantic, insistent sound that had just begun. It was Rusty. The dog, who had refused to come closer than the ravine's edge, was now scrambling down the bank, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a more powerful, urgent instinct. He ignored the bones, ignored Caleb and Martha, and ran to a spot a few feet away, near the base of the bridge's thick central piling. He began to dig, not playfully, but with a desperate, frantic energy, his paws tearing at the hard-packed earth, sending clumps of dirt flying. He whined as he dug, a sound of intense concentration and memory. "Rusty, no! Get away from there!" Caleb commanded, his voice sharp with a sudden, superstitious fear. But the dog was deaf to him, lost in his work. "Let him be," Martha said, her voice raspy with tears. She had looked up, her face pale in the twilight. "He knows something." As if summoned by the scene, a new figure appeared on the opposite bank. An old man, stooped and weathered, his face a roadmap of worry. It was Elias Whitmore, Caleb's nearest neighbor, a man who kept to himself, whose own ranch was slowly failing. He stood there for a long moment, wringing his hands, his eyes filled with a terrible, haunted light. Then, with the slow, pained gait of a man walking to his own execution, he made his way down into the creek bed. "I knew this day would come," Elias rasped, his voice a dry whisper. He wasn't looking at Caleb or Martha. His eyes were fixed on the bones. "With the water gone, I knew the creek would tell. It always tells." "Elias, what are you talking about?" Caleb demanded, stepping between the old man and Martha. Elias's eyes finally met his, and Caleb saw a guilt so profound it was like a physical illness. "I saw it," he confessed, the words tumbling out, pulled from a place of long, festering shame. 7 years ago, I was checking my fences, up on that ridge." He pointed a trembling finger. "I saw the wagon on the bridge. Fletcher Kane and 2 of his men were there. They were arguing with the young fella. It got loud. Then there was a gunshot." The word hung in the air, echoing in the silent ravine. Martha let out another small, wounded sound. "Fletcher," Caleb breathed, the name tasting like poison. Fletcher Kane was a man who had grown too rich, too fast, a rancher whose herds seemed to magically multiply, who had the territorial officials in his pocket, and whose men were known for their casual brutality. He was a shadow over the whole valley, a man people feared and avoided. "They pushed the wagon over the side," Elias continued, his voice breaking. "Tossed the body in after it. I saw them. I saw them bury something right over there." He pointed to the exact spot where Rusty was still digging, his paws now caked in dark, damp soil. "An iron box. I hid. I was afraid. Fletcher, he runs this valley. He'd have killed me, killed my family. So I said nothing. I kept the secret, and it's been eating me alive every day since." His confession, a torrent of guilt and fear, was cut short by a new sound, the crunch of boots on gravel from the direction of the bridge. 4 figures descended into the creek bed, their forms dark silhouettes against the last dying light of the sky. The man in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of absolute predatory confidence. Caleb recognized him instantly. It was Fletcher Kane. He was flanked by 2 of his hard-faced henchmen, and they were all armed. "Well, well," Fletcher said, his voice a smooth, dangerous baritone that held no surprise. "Looks like the drought's brought all sorts of things to the surface." He smiled, but it was a cold, reptilian thing. "Evening, Elias. I always wondered if you'd seen more than you let on that night. Looks like your conscience finally got the better of you." His gaze shifted to Caleb, then to Martha, and finally to the pathetic mound of bones on the ground. Finding things that don't belong to you can be bad for your health. The historical mystery of a 7-year-old murder had just become an immediate, deadly threat. Rusty, oblivious to the men, let out a sharp yelp and redoubled his digging, his claws finally striking something hard with a dull, metallic thud. The sound sealed their fate. Fletcher's smile widened. He had not just come to investigate, he had come to permanently clean up the last loose ends of his crime. The air in the dry creek bed was thick enough to choke on. The last vestiges of twilight had bled from the sky, leaving a deep, star-dusted indigo. The only light came from 2 lanterns Caleb had the presence of mind to light when he saw Fletcher and his men approach, their flickering yellow flames casting huge dancing shadows against the clay banks and the skeletal pylons of the bridge. The scene was a tableau of confrontation. Fletcher Kane, flanked by his two silent, watchful men, stood with the relaxed posture of a wolf who has cornered his prey. Opposite him, Caleb stood protectively in front of Martha, his body tense, his mind racing. Elias Whitmore seemed to have shrunk into himself, a ghost haunted by his own cowardice. And at the center of it all was Rusty, panting over the patch of earth where his frantic digging had unearthed the corner of a dark metal object. "You're a little late for the funeral, Fletcher," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline in his veins. Fletcher chuckled, a low, arrogant sound. "On the contrary, Morrison, it seems I've arrived right on time to prevent another one from being necessary." His eyes, dark pools in the lantern light, flicked to the exposed bones. Thomas Kane. That was his name. Ambitious young man, too ambitious. Came out here with his surveyor's tools and his righteous little notebooks, thinking he could upset the natural order of things. "The natural order?" Martha spat, her grief momentarily burned away by a hot flash of rage. "You mean your order? Stealing land and water from honest folk?" "Honesty is a luxury, ma'am," Fletcher said, his gaze settling on her with a chilling lack of emotion. "Out here, there's what you can take and what you can hold. Your brother didn't understand that. He found out how my partners and I were encouraging settlement on certain parcels. Parcels the territorial governor himself had a keen interest in seeing developed by the right people. Thomas found the real ledgers, the proof of payments. He put it all in that strongbox of his." He gestured with his chin toward the ground at Rusty's feet. "He thought he could take that to the Capitol and be a hero. He was a fool." "So you murdered him," Caleb stated, the words flat and cold. Fletcher shrugged, a casual gesture that was more damning than any confession. "He was an obstacle to progress, a threat to a very profitable enterprise. I gave him a choice, walk away and live. He chose to be a martyr, a stupid choice." He took a step forward, the leather of his boots creaking. "Just like coming here was a stupid choice for you, ma'am. And getting involved is a stupid choice for you, Morrison. And talking, Elias, that was the stupidest choice of all." From the darkness on the ridge above, a voice cut through the tension, calm and methodical. "I'd say it was the smartest thing he's done in 7 years. Every head snapped up. Silhouetted against the stars on both banks of the creek stood a dozen figures. The glint of moonlight on rifle barrels was unmistakable. Sheriff Ben Hawkins stepped forward into the edge of the lantern light, his face grim, his shotgun held at a relaxed but ready angle. He wasn't alone. His deputies were with him, silent and positioned with tactical precision. Fletcher's face, for the first time, lost its mask of smug control. A flicker of disbelief, then fury, crossed his features. "Hawkins, you have no jurisdiction out here." "Drought's a funny thing, Fletcher," the sheriff said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "It doesn't much care for lines on a map. When Martha Kane came back to my office last week, said she was heading to this valley because a rancher's dog was acting strange around the old bridge. Well, it got me thinking. A patient man can wait a long time for the truth to surface. A patient lawman can, too." He nodded toward Elias. "Mr. Whitmore here rode hard to my office 2 hours ago. Seems his conscience got the better of him right when it mattered most. His sworn statement, combined with your little speech just now, I'd say that's more than enough." Fletcher's eyes darted around, assessing his options, the predator suddenly finding himself in a cage. His men shifted nervously, their hands hovering over their holsters. The standoff was absolute, a frozen moment of violent potential. In that silence, Rusty, who had been watching the confrontation with a low growl, suddenly let out a sharp bark and gave one last powerful heave. With a scraping sound of metal on stone, the iron strongbox broke free from the earth. It was small, rusted, and caked in 7 years of mud. But it was there. The physical proof, the motive, the heart of the entire crime, unearthed by the victim's loyal companion. The sight of it seemed to break something in Fletcher. The cold calculation in his eyes was replaced by a wild, cornered desperation. With a speed that defied his size, he lunged, not for his gun, but for Martha. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, the muzzle of his pistol pressed hard against her temple. "Nobody moves!" he roared, his voice raw with panic. "Hawkins, you call them off! Call them off or she dies right here!" Martha cried out, a sound of terror and surprise. Caleb took an involuntary step forward, his hands clenched into useless fists. The deputies tensed, their rifles half raised. The night teetered on the edge of a bloody explosion. And then, something extraordinary happened. Rusty, who had been cowering under a bridge from the ghost of this man for 7 years, saw the source of his trauma physically lay hands on the new, fragile family he had come to guard. The dog had spent years fleeing a memory. Now, the memory was flesh and blood, threatening the man who fed him and the woman whose grief he seemed to understand. A deep, savage growl ripped from his chest, a sound unlike any Caleb had ever heard him make. It was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of pure, protective fury. For 7 years, the bridge and the man who embodied its horror had paralyzed him. But now, seeing Martha in Cain's grasp, a deeper, more primal instinct took over. The loyalty that had been his only constant. Before anyone could react, Rusty launched himself through the air. He was not a cowering pup anymore. He was a 70-pound projectile of muscle and teeth. He slammed into Fletcher's side, his jaws closing on the arm that held the gun. Fletcher screamed, a sound of shock and agony, his aim thrown off. The gun discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet singing harmlessly into the night sky. He staggered back, trying to shake the dog off, but Rusty held on with the tenacity of a creature settling a 7-year score. The distraction was all it took. In a blur of motion, Sheriff Hawkins was on him. The butt of the sheriff's shotgun came down hard on Fletcher's wrist, and the pistol clattered to the stones. Deputies swarmed down from the banks, and in seconds, Fletcher's men were disarmed and on their knees. Fletcher himself was thrown face down into the dirt he had used to hide his crime, his hands wrenched behind his back. Caleb rushed to Martha, who had stumbled away, gasping but unharmed. He held her steady, his own body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. His eyes went to his dog. Rusty had let go of Fletcher's arm and now stood over the subdued criminal, his body rigid, his teeth bared, a low, triumphant growl rumbling in his chest. His long vigil was over. He hadn't just unearthed a secret, he had confronted his own demon and in a final, desperate act of courage had protected his own. The lantern light flickered on the rusted strongbox, the subdued criminals, and the loyal dog who had served as a guardian of memory, finally bringing a violent and long-buried truth into the light. The autumn rains came late that year, but when they arrived, they came with a gentle persistence, as if to apologize for the summer's cruelty. The first drops fell on a valley transformed. The air, for months thick with dust and the scent of decay, was suddenly clean and sharp, carrying the rich, loamy smell of petrichor, the perfume of thirsty earth drinking its fill. The sound of it was a balm, a soft, steady drumming on the roof of Caleb's house, a whispering hiss across the parched fields. Within a week, a faint, tentative blush of green had returned to the hillsides. Miller's Creek, the dry, gaping wound that had exposed the valley's dark heart, began to flow again. At first it was a trickle, a muddy current weaving its way through the clean-swept stones, but soon it grew into a confident, clear stream, its gurgling voice a song of renewal that washed away the silence and the sorrow. Justice, like the rain, had been thorough. The testimony of Elias Whitmore, combined with the damning evidence within the iron strongbox, had been enough to unravel Fletcher Cain's entire criminal enterprise. The land and water rights records Thomas Cain had died to protect were laid bare, leading investigators all the way to the territorial capital. The governor and a half-dozen corrupt officials were implicated, their careers and reputations ruined in a scandal that rocked the territory. Fletcher Cain and his men were tried and sentenced, their arrogant power broken, their names reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in saloons and general stores. The natural order they had sought to create through violence and fear had collapsed under the simple weight of truth. Martha Kane stayed at the ranch for another 2 weeks. She was quiet, her grief a tangible presence, but it was a different kind of grief now. The ragged, searching edge was gone, replaced by a somber peace. She had found her brother. Sheriff Hawkins had helped her arrange for Thomas's remains to be gathered with dignity. They were placed in a simple pine coffin that Caleb built with his own hands. The day she left, she stood by her buckboard, her hand resting on the coffin in the back. "I don't know how to thank you, Caleb," she said, her clear blue eyes meeting his. "For your kindness, for believing me." "I didn't believe you," Caleb answered honestly. "I believed my dog. He's the one you should be thanking." He looked down at Rusty, who stood calmly by his side, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against Caleb's leg. The dog seemed different. The haunted, anxious energy was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He had faced the source of his trauma and had won. The physical confrontation had been a kind of exorcism. Martha smiled, a true, sad smile. She knelt and wrapped her arms around the dog's thick neck. "Thank you, Rusty," she whispered into his fur. "You were a good friend to him. You kept watch." The dog licked her cheek, a simple, accepting gesture. Caleb and Rusty stood on the porch and watched her buckboard until it was just a speck on the horizon, taking Thomas Kane home for a proper burial, 7 years late. A profound quiet settled over the ranch, but it was not the empty silence of before. It was a full silence, a silence of peace and resolution. The world felt right again. The weeks that followed were filled with the familiar rhythms of ranch life, but everything felt new. The cattle grew fat on the resurgent grass. The air grew crisp with the coming of winter. Caleb spent his days mending the fences the drought had weakened, and his nights reading by the fire, Rusty sleeping soundly at his feet. The nightmares were gone. The mournful midnight howls were replaced by the contented sighs of a dog at peace. One cool, bright morning, Caleb decided it was time. He had spent a week repairing the wooden bridge over Miller's Creek. He'd replaced the warped, rotted planks with fresh-cut pine, reinforced the railings, and tightened the bolts on the pilings. The bridge was no longer a bleached, splintered skeleton. It was strong and whole, smelling of sawdust and clean wood. He whistled for Rusty, and they began their walk, the same 3-mile loop they had taken for 7 years. As they approached the bridge, Caleb felt a familiar knot of tension in his own stomach. The habit of anticipating the dog's fear was deeply ingrained. He watched Rusty, ready for the first sign. The flattening of the ears, the low whine, the trembling. But it never came. Rusty walked beside him with an easy, confident gait, his tail held high, his nose twitching as he took in the scents of the damp earth and the flowing water. They reached the edge of the first plank, the spot that had marked the absolute limit of the dog's courage for so long. Caleb stopped. Rusty looked up at him, his intelligent brown eyes questioning the pause. Then he looked at the bridge. He looked at the clear water flowing beneath it. He took a tentative step onto the first plank, his claws making a soft clicking sound on the new wood. He paused, tested his weight, and then, with no hesitation at all, he calmly and confidently trotted across to the other side. He stood there, waiting, his tail wagging as if to say, "Well, are you coming?" A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, a feeling of profound relief and rightness washing over him. He walked onto the bridge, his boots thudding a steady rhythm on the solid planks. He stopped in the middle and leaned on the railing, looking down at the creek. The water was full and clear, flowing without impediment. The moral and natural order of the valley had been restored. The secrets of the earth had been revealed, and the corrosive power of guilt and fear had been washed away by courage and the cleansing rain. He felt Rusty press against his leg, a warm, solid presence. He rested his hand on the dog's head, and together they stood in the quiet morning sun, a man and his dog on a bridge that was no longer a barrier or a tombstone, but simply a way to get to the other side. The valley was filled with a sense of hard-won peace, a peace built one splinter and one scar at a time. a peace that felt earned and true and lasting.